40 feet above the farmland of northern Italy, an A-20 Havoc attack bomber roared across the gray morning sky, trailing a thin ribbon of smoke from its right engine. The aircraft held steady at 190 miles per hour. Inside the cockpit, the fuel gauges told an uncomfortable story. Only 11 minutes of flight time remained. 9 holes already punctured the fuselage, where German anti-aircraft fire had found the aircraft earlier. At this altitude, with that much damage, the math of survival was brutally simple. There was no realistic path home, and yet the aircraft continued straight toward another target. The morning of April 24th, 1945, broke cold and overcast across the Po Valley. Low clouds pressed down to barely 2,000 feet. Light rain blurred the horizon. It was the kind of weather that normally grounded attack aircraft. Low visibility forced pilots to fly dangerously close to the ground. And ground fire became far more lethal when aircraft had nowhere to hide. But the war in Italy had entered its final phase. German forces were collapsing. Retreating north toward the Po River, they were attempting to evacuate aircraft, vehicles, and supplies before Allied armies cut off their escape routes. Every German aircraft that managed to escape meant more resistance somewhere else. Every intact ammunition dump meant more casualties for advancing Allied troops. The Allied command had issued simple instructions to its attack squadrons: destroy everything that moves. The 350th Fighter Group, operating from an airfield near Pisa, had been given that exact mission. They flew A-20 Havocs, fast twin-engine attack bombers designed for low-level strikes. Their targets were airfields, trains, supply depots, and convoys. Anything the Germans might use during their retreat. First Lieutenant Raymond L. Knight had already flown one mission that morning. At 0630 hours, he had taken off with 3 other aircraft and attacked German positions near Bergamo. The strike had gone exactly as planned. Targets hit. No losses. All aircraft returned. Routine work for an experienced attack pilot. But intelligence reports arriving back at Pisa indicated that German aircraft were still being moved across several nearby airfields. Reconnaissance photos showed Ju-88 bombers, Bf-109 fighters, and transport aircraft scattered along tree lines and revetments. The Luftwaffe was trying desperately to save what remained. Those aircraft had to be destroyed before they could escape. Knight volunteered immediately for a second mission. No one found that surprising. Volunteering was simply what he did. The afternoon briefing identified 3 targets: Pitti Airfield, Villafranca Airfield, Bergamo Airfield. All 3 contained confirmed enemy aircraft. All 3 were protected by anti-aircraft guns. The attack plan was straightforward. Approach at extremely low altitude. Strike quickly. Destroy aircraft on the ground. Then escape before enemy gunners could adjust their fire. Low-level attacks meant flying 50 feet above the ground or lower. At that height, the A-20 Havoc was both powerful and dangerously vulnerable. Its twin Wright R-2600 engines produced 1,600 horsepower each. In level flight, the aircraft could reach nearly 300 miles per hour. But during attack runs, bomb doors open, pilot focused on the target, speed dropped closer to 200 miles per hour. 200 miles per hour across defended airspace meant something important. German gunners had about 3 seconds to fire. 3 seconds was often enough. The A-20 had never been designed to remain over defended targets. It was a strike aircraft, fast and maneuverable for its size, but lightly armored. The cockpit canopy could shatter under concentrated fire. Fuel tanks could seal small punctures, but sustained hits would ignite them. The engines mounted on the wings were exposed targets for anti-aircraft guns. One well-placed 20mm shell could end everything. Every A-20 pilot understood the rules. One pass, destroy the target, then escape. Each additional pass gave enemy gunners more time to adjust their aim, more time to fill the sky with steel. The mathematics were simple. The longer you stayed, the more likely you died. Raymond Knight understood those calculations perfectly. He had grown up far from the battlefields of Europe. Born on October 18, 1921, in Houston, Texas, he grew up during the golden age of aviation. The world was fascinated by flight. Newspapers celebrated the achievements of pilots like Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart. Young boys built model airplanes from balsa wood and dreamed of flying. But Knight's path into aviation was not driven by adventure or glory. It was practical. In 1942, he enlisted in the Army Air Forces as the United States rapidly expanded its air power after Pearl Harbor. Training followed a strict system: primary flight training, basic training, advanced training, a methodical pipeline that transformed civilians into military pilots. Knight progressed steadily. His instructors described him as reliable rather than brilliant. He followed procedures carefully, accepted corrections without argument, performed consistently. Those traits rarely attracted attention during training, but in combat they often meant survival. Aggressive pilots sometimes made fatal mistakes. Natural talent without discipline led to dangerous improvisation. Knight was different. He was methodical, calm, professional. He eventually joined the 346th Fighter Squadron of the 350th Fighter Group in the Mediterranean Theater. The unit initially flew P-39 Airacobra fighters. Later they transitioned to P-47 Thunderbolts. Eventually the squadron shifted to A-20 Havocs for ground attack missions during the final months of the Italian campaign. Flying the A-20 required a different mindset than fighter combat. Fighters relied on instinct and maneuverability. Attack bombers required planning, fuel calculations, attack geometry, carefully timed weapons delivery. Knight adapted easily. His fellow pilots described him as quiet, not withdrawn, just focused. He didn't boast about missions. He didn't exaggerate stories. He simply flew, returned, prepared for the next mission. By April 1945, Knight had become a seasoned combat pilot. He knew exactly what the A-20 could do and what it could not. More importantly, he knew when to break off an attack. That decision, the moment when risk crossed into suicide, often separated experienced pilots from those who never came home. And on the afternoon of April 24, 1945, Raymond Knight would face that decision again. Only this time, he would choose a different answer. Until that afternoon, Raymond Knight had always trusted the mathematics of survival. He understood the invisible line every attack pilot lived by: push hard enough to destroy the target, but not so hard that the aircraft never came home. Again and again during previous missions, he had demonstrated exactly that judgment. He was not reckless. He did not chase targets blindly or linger over defended airfields. He attacked. He destroyed what he could, and then he left. But April 24, 1945 would become the day when those calculations changed. The tempo of operations for the 350th Fighter Group during the final weeks of the war in Italy had become relentless. Aircraft launched at dawn, returned by mid-morning, refueled, rearmed, and often launched again before noon. Every hour mattered. German forces were collapsing across northern Italy, and the Luftwaffe was desperately trying to evacuate anything that could still fly. Bombers, fighters, transport aircraft, anything capable of escaping across the Alps into Austria. If those aircraft escaped, they could still threaten Allied forces later. If they were destroyed on the ground, they would never fly again. That was the logic driving the mission. Knight approached every sortie with careful preparation. Before each flight, he studied the intelligence briefings. When reconnaissance photographs were available, he examined them closely. He memorized the locations of revetments, possible anti-aircraft gun positions, nearby terrain that might conceal his approach, tree lines, farm buildings, roadways. Every detail mattered. This was not heroism. It was professionalism. The pilots who survived multiple attack missions shared the same habits. They planned carefully, executed precisely, and understood the limits of their aircraft. Knight's earlier missions followed that exact pattern. During previous attacks on enemy airfields, he had approached at maximum speed while still maintaining accuracy. Whenever possible, he used terrain masking, flying low along tree lines or behind buildings to remain hidden until the last seconds before opening fire. He had taken damage before. All attack pilots had. The aluminum skin of the A-20 often carried the scars of previous missions. Patches over bullet holes, replaced panels, repaired control surfaces. It was part of the job. But Knight had never pushed beyond the limits of calculated risk. If anti-aircraft fire became too intense, he adjusted his attack. If a target proved too well defended, he reported the situation and let planners schedule another strike. Doctrine existed because it worked. The rules were simple. One pass, then escape. Every additional pass gave enemy gunners more time to adjust their aim, more time to saturate the air with shells. The longer a pilot stayed over a target, the worse the odds became. Knight followed those rules because they kept pilots alive. His mission logs from the weeks before April 24th showed steady, consistent performance. Targets destroyed. Aircraft recovered. Nothing spectacular. Nothing reckless. Nothing that hinted at what was coming. But combat sometimes reveals things about people that training never measures. Sometimes a moment arrives when the calculations produce an answer doctrine never expected. Sometimes the numbers say that one pass is not enough. The second mission of the day launched from Pisa early that afternoon. Knight led a small formation of A-20 Havocs toward the first target, Guidi Airfield, nearly 150 miles to the northeast. The weather had not improved. Clouds still hung low over the valley. Visibility remained poor. Pilots were forced to fly lower than they preferred. Low altitude meant greater accuracy, but it also meant greater exposure to enemy guns. The formation flew northeast beneath the cloud base. Below them stretched the flat farmland of the Po Valley, fields divided by irrigation canals, small villages connected by narrow roads, occasional factories and rail yards, and somewhere ahead, German anti-aircraft gunners waiting. As they approached Guidi Airfield, Knight dropped to attack altitude, 50 feet, maybe less. The airfield perimeter appeared ahead exactly where intelligence predicted. Dispersed aircraft sat along the northern edge of the runway. Camouflage positions, revetments cut into the ground, machines waiting to be evacuated north. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire at roughly 800 yards. Tracers streaked upward immediately. 20mm and 37mm shells carved bright lines across the sky. Inside the cockpit, Knight heard the sound every pilot recognized. Sharp cracks. Supersonic rounds passing dangerously close. He did not alter course. The A-20 surged forward. Knight squeezed the trigger. 6 forward firing. 50 caliber machine guns erupted together. At 200 miles per hour, he had roughly 12 seconds to attack. 12 seconds before he crossed the airfield and escaped the firing zone. The first pass caught a German aircraft directly in its revetment. The shape suggested an FW-190 fighter. Knight's tracers walked across the dispersal area. Fuel ignited. Flames erupted beneath the camouflage netting. He pulled up at the far end of the field, banked sharply left. A church steeple suddenly appeared in his flight path, and he rolled around it before continuing his escape. Under normal circumstances, the mission was complete. Target destroyed. Time to go home. But as Knight glanced back across the airfield, he noticed something unexpected. More aircraft. Several of them, hidden deeper along the tree lines. Improvised dispersal positions that reconnaissance photographs had not revealed. The Germans had packed far more aircraft onto the field than intelligence predicted. Knight turned the Havoc around. For another pass. This time the German gunners were ready. They had seen his approach, measured his speed, calculated his altitude. When Knight came back across the field, the sky filled with anti-aircraft fire. A wall of tracers. To reach the remaining aircraft, he would have to fly directly through it. He flew through it. The Havoc shuddered violently as shells struck the fuselage. Something tore through the right wing with the sound of ripping metal. But the aircraft held together. Knight kept the attack line steady. His guns found another target. This time a Ju-88 bomber hidden beneath camouflage netting. The bomber exploded into flames. Second pass complete. Damage assessment was quick. Right wing punctured. Fuel leak beginning. But both engines still running. Doctrine now offered a clear answer. Break off. Return to base. But Knight knew something else. There were more targets. And Villafranca Airfield lay only a short distance east. Intelligence reports had confirmed additional aircraft there. Destroying every German aircraft possible was the entire purpose of the mission. Knight turned the Havoc east, toward Villafranca. The decision marked the moment when the mission crossed from calculated risk into something else entirely. He was now flying a damaged aircraft, leaking fuel, heading toward a second defended airfield, after already absorbing fire that justified returning home. But the Havoc kept flying east across the Po Valley, and the second target was waiting. The defenses around Villafranca Airfield were heavier than anything Knight had faced earlier that day. Anti-aircraft guns were arranged carefully around the field, positioned so their firing arcs overlapped. Any aircraft attacking the runway would have to fly through several layers of defensive fire. And this time the gunners were ready. Radio warnings from the earlier attack had already spread through the valley. American aircraft were operating in the area. The next one would not arrive as a surprise. Knight approached from the southwest, using a thin line of trees to hide his final run toward the airfield. For a few seconds, the terrain shielded him. Then the guns found him. At roughly 400 yards, the anti-aircraft fire intensified. Tracers streaked upward in thick streams. Inside the cockpit, the impacts were no longer distant sounds. Knight could feel them. 20mm shells punched through the aluminum skin of the aircraft. Metal rattled through the fuselage. The right engine began trailing smoke, but he stayed on course. 3 aircraft sat in a dispersal area east of the runway. They appeared to be fighters, partially hidden under camouflage netting. From higher altitude, they might have been invisible, but at Knight's extremely low altitude, he could see through the camouflage. He opened fire. The 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted again. Tracers swept across the revetment. One aircraft ignited immediately as its fuel tanks ruptured. The other 2 were hit repeatedly. Whether they were destroyed or simply disabled was impossible to know from the cockpit. Knight pulled up over the edge of the airfield. Now the damage to his own aircraft was becoming severe. The right engine was failing. Power fluctuated unevenly. The aircraft began pulling to the right, forcing Knight to fight the rudder pedals to keep it flying straight. Fuel gauges showed the leak had worsened. His reserves were draining far faster than normal. By any reasonable measure, the mission had already succeeded. 2 airfields attacked. Several enemy aircraft destroyed. Knight could have turned south and attempted the long flight back toward Pisa. But there was still another target. Bergamo Airfield. He had attacked it earlier that morning, and intelligence reports suggested more aircraft had arrived there since. His aircraft was damaged. Fuel was running low. One engine was failing. Even returning to base was uncertain. Flying to Bergamo would make survival even less likely. Knight turned north. The decision violated nearly every principle of attack aviation. A damaged aircraft, a fuel leak, one failing engine, a pilot already exhausted from hours of combat. Under normal circumstances, the outcome was predictable. Aircraft loss, pilot casualty. German ground controllers monitoring Allied radio frequencies would have noticed something unusual. The American aircraft was not behaving according to expected patterns. Attack aircraft normally made 1 pass, perhaps 2 if conditions allowed. Then they withdrew. This aircraft was doing the opposite. It had already attacked multiple targets. It was visibly damaged, yet it was still approaching another defended airfield. At Bergamo, German personnel received warning of the incoming aircraft. They had seen it earlier that morning. Now it was returning, trailing smoke, still coming. By the time Knight reached Bergamo, the A-20 was barely functioning. The right engine produced only a fraction of its normal power. Fuel was nearly exhausted. Control surfaces responded sluggishly, but Knight pushed the aircraft even lower, 40 feet above the ground. At that altitude, the attack run resembled less a maneuver and more a controlled crash. He traded every remaining margin of safety for accuracy. The anti-aircraft fire erupted the moment he appeared. 20mm and 37mm guns opened up simultaneously. Tracers filled the sky between Knight and the airfield. The probability of surviving repeated passes through such fire was extremely low. Knight made his first pass. His remaining guns, some already damaged, found targets. Aircraft and revetments erupted in flames. Fuel stores detonated. Explosions spread across the field. He pulled up sharply, barely cleared a hangar roof. The Havoc shuddered violently as more rounds struck. Then the right engine finally failed completely. The propeller spun uselessly in the wind. Now the aircraft was flying on a single engine, with almost no fuel, and an airframe riddled with damage. Doctrine offered only one solution: break off, attempt an emergency landing. But Knight turned back again. To the German gunners below, the situation must have seemed impossible. The aircraft was clearly crippled. No pilot should have continued the attack. Yet the Havoc kept returning. Again and again. The exact number of attack passes Knight made over Bergamo varies in historical accounts, but all agree on one fact: he attacked multiple times. By now the mission had changed. This was no longer about returning safely to base. Knight understood that survival was no longer part of the calculation. The only question remaining was, how much damage could he inflict before the aircraft stopped flying? Each attack destroyed more targets. aircraft in revetments, vehicles on service roads, facilities that had escaped earlier strikes. Later reconnaissance confirmed heavy damage across the airfield. Several aircraft destroyed, ground installations damaged, operations disrupted during the final phase of the German retreat. When night finally turned away from Bergamo, the Havoc was barely airborne. One engine dead, the second losing power, fuel nearly gone, the airframe dangerously damaged. He turned south toward Allied lines. Returning to Pisa, more than 120 miles away, was impossible. His only chance was to reach friendly territory and attempt a forced landing. Approximately 15 minutes later, Knight crossed into Allied-controlled territory. The aircraft was flying extremely low, barely maintaining speed. At that point, he still had options. He could have bailed out with his parachute. He might have attempted a crash landing in an open field. What happened next remains uncertain. Historical records differ. The aircraft crashed in Allied-held territory in northern Italy. Whether Knight attempted a landing that failed, whether mechanical failure took control away, or whether the aircraft simply could not remain airborne is unclear. First Lieutenant Raymond L. Knight died on April 25, 1945. He was 23 years old. More than a year later, on September 2, 1946, the United States awarded him the Medal of Honor. The official citation describes repeated attacks against heavily defended airfields. It records the destruction of numerous German aircraft. It notes that Knight continued his mission despite damage that should have forced him to withdraw. But official language cannot capture what happened inside the cockpit. The moment when the gauges show no fuel, the engine begins to fail, the distance to safety becomes impossible, and the calculations leave only one conclusion. Knight did not ignore those calculations. He understood them perfectly. He simply chose a different answer. The aircraft he destroyed would not change the outcome of the war. Germany was already collapsing. But for Allied soldiers advancing through northern Italy, every destroyed aircraft meant one less attack from the air. Every disabled airfield meant fewer organized defenses. Knight's decision was not driven by glory. His life gave no sign of a man seeking dramatic moments. He was quiet, methodical, professional. On April 24, 1945, he simply applied the same logic he always had. Sometimes one pass is enough. Sometimes it isn't. And sometimes a pilot who knows exactly when to break away discovers that he also knows when not to.